Today is the 100th episode of the Podski, and we are celebrating by covering the WWF WCW invasion, and the Podski starts now.
The Podski with John Baker. For over 1 year, the revolutionary force in audio entertainment.
Ooh, yeah!
Brother,
Let me talk to you! Freak out, freak out!
I just had an out-of-body experience!
Insane in the membrane!
Brother,
Yeah! And I'm here for only one reason, and that's to take it to the limit, yeah!
somebody stop the damn man!
I'm living on the edge.
Who is your daddy?
Hello and welcome to the 100th episode of the Podski. I'm your host, Johnny Bake Show, and ringside with me is Teddy Mongoose. From the pilot episode to today's show, it has been a long journey, and it feels like we're only scratching the surface here of the Podski. We appreciate all the recent support we've been getting. It's all because of you, the listeners, and that's why for the 100th episode, we are doing the highly requested from our day one listener, Uncle Jamie. This one's for you, brother. If you have a show topic that you want us to cover here, let us know in the comments below. The Podski has been primarily living in 1999 and 2004, and that's not changing. We're still sticking to the script, so if you're watching along on YouTube, you will see the June lineup of shows. So that's where we're headed moving forward. We do have a window where we can do requested shows like this invasion one. So again, if you have something that you want us to cover that we haven't done already in the archives, let us know in the comments and we'll slide it into the weeks that were off on 1999 and 2004. So please, if you have not subscribed, we have subscriber rewards. This is also how we're giving back to you, the listeners. When we hit our benchmarks, we will give you bio bonus episodes of your favorite wrestlers of the past. So we are closing in on the Rick Rude bonus episode. We are very close, only a few more to go. So once we hit 400, we're going to give you that bonus episode. And if you want to go back to know what that's going to look like, you can go back to the Davey Boy episode from 2 weeks ago. And that bio section is basically a mini snapshot of what we're talking about here with these bio episodes. So for the 100th episode, we've been talking about it in our 1999 shows, specifically WrestleMania 15 and the Backlash 1999 show, where Dave Meltzer declared the Monday Night Wars are over. It is done. However, the war continued until 2001, until the Simulcast, and that is what we're working towards here in part one. Before we get into our main event today, which is the last Monday Nitro, Teddy, I'm going to toss it over to you so you can give us some background on the state of major pro wrestling at that time.
Happy to be here for the big 100 triple digits. Thank you very much, John. And so we start with the new millennium. We've been working so much 99. We've now made the crossover here. So before we get into the invasion show itself and what really got us there, the fall of two companies, I figured the best way for us to start would be with some business notes. And I have WWF first. And the last time we talked WWF, it was hot fire, right? Everything that they did was just turned into gold. So the notes that I have here actually come from the February 19th, 2001 Observer newsletter. We'll be doing a little bit of jumping back and forth with the lead up and build up to the invasion show. But this was the issue that took the previous year's business and then gave us some context to the years before that. So for the WWF, Dave Meltzer says, quote, strong, but there are noticeable signs that the core business has passed its peak, end quote. And what's interesting about that is that we are at literally the end of the Attitude Era. It is widely regarded that WrestleMania 17 is where it ends, right?
That's my cutoff in my head. As soon as Austin hands that chair to Vince, Attitude Era is dead.
Because the Attitude Era was defined by Austin versus McMahon, right? Like The Rock could go back and forth between corporate and babyface and whatever, and it didn't matter, but that was a hard line that was drawn.
Mm-hmm.
And so I believe that you are correct. And we'll be able to we stick with this long enough, we do some 2002 to 2001 comparisons, so on and so forth. But so in 2000, yearly average house show attendance is down 4.6% from 1999. So it drops from 12,017 fans per show to 11,460 per show in 2000. Okay, so a small drop in house show attendance. However, and this is a big however, the live arena business is up. So it's increased to an average of $330,588 per show. And this is mostly due to ticket price increases. So even though attendance dropped, ticket prices are going up. That actual gate per show number is up 15.4% from 1999. The number in 1999 was $286,495 per show. And then this was the crazy number. In 1998, that number was $188,482. So in 2000, they are doubling the gates of 1998.
And to even think about that in $2,000 or even $1998 of the inflation rate, all of that, the fact that they, in 2 years' time, just based off the run that they were on, they doubled their earnings per just regular old house show.
Correct. And that's the thing you need to consider is not only the ticket price, but obviously merchandise is flying off the shelves too.
Right.
And so that's really going to help with, all of that is that not only do you have these big gates, and I don't have merchandise numbers here, but I'm assuming that merchandise is also flying off the shelf at this time. So they are not hurting for money at this point in time. So note on ticket prices, they are now averaging $28.85 per ticket. Could you imagine?
Imagine if we would have spent $28 to go to WrestleMania.
Imagine spending $28.85 to go to Hershey.
I know.
Do you know what I'm saying? Like, that's what's crazy about this is that this is just per ticket. And that's taking into consideration pay-per-views, house shows, everything else. So you probably are able to go to the Giant Center for $14 or whatever at that time.
That's crazy. You'd spend $14 on a beer now at the Giant Center.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you absolutely would. And so that was $28.85 a ticket in 2000, up from $23.84 a ticket in 99, up from $18.84 per ticket in 1998. And reading this actually just kind of made me mad at my dad because I think of how many times he wouldn't take me to shows when I was a kid.
He could have won.
And look, man, I do understand that like $20 stretched a lot more in the mid 90s than it does now. But like, I'm like, come on, man. Like, this mattered to me. You couldn't help me out a little bit.
This shit means something to me, man.
Right? The really big number here is that the WWF sold out 53% of their shows in the year 2000. That was actually down from 63% sellouts the previous year. But the ticket price matters with the gates and everything else. So business isn't bad. But Dave does note that business has had a bigger decline from August to December. He says it's not worrisome or anywhere near that. But they only averaged 10,651 fans and 44% sellouts during that window. So
is that tied to football? Is that the beginning ties of where Monday Night Football was starting to like really gain back fans and stuff like that?
That is absolutely tied to the ratings. And we'll get to the ratings in just a second.
Ooh, okay.
With the gates, the argument always was if you're a wrestling fan, you will go to the wrestling show. Yes. But if you are a wrestling and football fan, a good football game will make you watch a football game over a wrestling show. Do you know what I'm saying? So I'm not saying that there is no impact there, but the smells off the rose just a little bit, right? Dude, you're still averaging 10,000 fans a show. You're selling out 44% of your shows. It's not anything bad, but there is a legit decline here. Pay-per-view is actually up from a 1.25 average buy rate in 1999 to a 1.34 average buy rate in 2000. So that's a 7% increase. Raw for that year averaged a 5.88 rating, and that was down 3% from 6.04 last year. It should be stated, and you segued me perfectly here, that Raw does go from USA to TNN. I don't know if you remember that, but that was the thing. Before Spike TV, we had the Nashville Network.
I love TNN.
Well, then there you go, man.
I started when it was on TNN. I only know TNN for a while.
So you walked into there like a rhinestone cowboy.
Did.
Not too bad. Yeah. So that was David mentioned that essentially you couldn't blame the fall on the network change, even though there was one. So they averaged a 6.17 on USA and a 5.03 in TNN. But they moved to TNN September 25th, 2000, which is in the heart of football season.
That makes
so when you asked about football, because the year 2000, man, we have the Rams, the greatest show on turf is a thing now. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers all of a sudden are they were a thing for a little bit. We are not yet at the Pats dynasty, but I do remember that 2000 NFL year as sort of being an inflection point of interest because there were not only new teams, but awesome teams that were catching younger viewers, especially.
Yes.
Like the greatest show on turf that's not gonna make my dad watch. That made me watch.
Right.
Like I used to play with the Rams so that I could throw the ball to Zahir Hakim, only because he was insanely fast. So Isaac Bruce and Torrey Holt would run him off the routes, and Zahir Hakim would just go on a beeline straight to the end zone, and then Kurt Warner would just throw moon balls, and it was awesome. And so you have like this injection of excitement into the NFL, and I really think that was sort of. And, we could look at that later on for a later date. But to me, that makes sense being somebody that was a teen at that time. The other thing that I need to say is that Raw, especially, was literally impervious to football in 98 and 99. Like there was no real movement whenever football season started. And that showed how strong Raw was. However, there are some chinks in the armor. So while the product is still printing money, while you still have this Stone Cold Rock WrestleMania is going to be the biggest mania ever. It's widely regarded as the greatest mania of all time, but football matters right here. And so for that build, and I think what goes sort of under the radar here, and it's not mentioned in any of the issues, but Mania 2000 was a real letdown.
Well, that's because it didn't have Stone Cold or Undertaker on the card.
And it was all the multi-man matches.
Yeah.
It was the McMahon in every corner. Like, I think that if you think about how much you dumped on Mania 15 watching the show, right? Just the show, not the angles, not the stars, but the show. And then you follow that up with Mania 2000, which was, I don't remember that one fondly.
The only
I could sort of
remember.
I could sort of see where, I could sort of see the not the big, but the beginning of the decline here.
Yeah, and that is true because WrestleMania 2000 or WrestleMania 16, we're going to cover that show next year, but 16 is really interesting because you're starting to get more of those younger stars. You're starting to get your Chris Benoit's and your Chris Jericho's. You get your Edge and Christian versus you had the triangle ladder match. So you're getting different style of matches, and it's not the stalwarts that you're used to. There's like a changing of the guard from 15 to 16. It's like the back half of the Attitude Era is starting to shift. They're coming out of the era, and it's culminated at 17.
Yeah, it is. It's something that deserves a deeper dive later on. But and to me, I don't know, because we've been following along and we did see Ed Ferreira put in his 2 weeks notice in May. So I don't know if we still have Russo there. We might not, but we might have the residuals of Russo.
Yeah.
With all the multi-man matches and things like that, which again, man, you got people on the card, and at a time when being on the card made a bigger payday, this stuff's all great, but WrestleManias aren't built off of a bunch of multi-man matches. They're built off of singles matches or straight tag team matches or whatever.
Yes.
And I think that sort of hampers it too, is that there isn't that, standout. If we look at Mania 15, at least there's Rock and Austin. If we look at 17, obviously there's Rock and Austin. If we look at 18, you have Rock and Hogan as the big match that stands out. And we could sort of go Mania by Mania and think of that big singles, whereas 16 or 2000, whichever you want to call it, doesn't have that.
You're right. I cannot think of a singles match in that show. I literally can't.
And there might not be one. We juxtapose very good with WWF with very bad with WCW. So Dave Meltzer says, and I quote, WCW was a disaster this year. So attendance was cut in half from the years 99 to 2000. So they went from 5,511 fans a show in 99 to 2,677 fans a show in 2000. This was after attendance already dropped 46% from 98 to 99. So they were doing almost 10K a show in 98. They dropped to 5,500 in 99, and they are at 2,600 some change in the year 2000.
They literally dropped 7,500 to 8,000 people in a building.
Yeah. Yes. They absolutely lost 75% of their audience in 2 years. So the average house show was $70,188 per show. The WWF, remind you, was $330,000. That was down from $142,669 the year prior. So they're down 51% on gates. Average ticket prices remain constant. So $25.89 in 99, $26.22 in 2000. No real change there. Nitro in the year 1998 was averaging a 4.47 rating. And that beat Raw's overall average for the year. That was still in the 83 weeks. Raw for that year averaged 4.40. In 1999, Nitro's rating fell to a 3.66 average. And in 2000, it fell to a 2.68 average. So people aren't going to the shows and people aren't watching on TV. And the crazy thing about that is there is a 27% drop year over year for WCW. And they even cut from 3 hours back to 2. So in theory, that should help your average out.
This is when they're just handing out free tickets, correct?
There are free tickets. There are a lot of things that are trying to rejuvenate interest in the business at that point in time. And so the crazy thing is that attendance is down, and I haven't said anything for paid attendance. I've only said attendance. Do you know what I'm saying?
That's like it doesn't compute in my mind as you were reading. I was like, because it looks full, but I know that they handed out free tickets.
Yes. They're also playing in smaller buildings here.
Oh yeah.
So they are, instead of booking the Georgia Dome, they are going to your smaller arenas at that point in time, which is smart, but that doesn't mean that they're not losing money hand over fist. So in 1998, WCW sold out 49% of its house shows. That is down to 15% in 1999. And in the year 2000, the company sold out exactly one show domestically.
One
show was sold out, and it was in January of the year 2000.
What show was that? A Nitro or was it a pay-per-view?
I don't have that one specifically noted here. It does say that there were some international tour dates that did sell out, but domestically there was one sellout that happened in January. For pay-per-views, WWF was actually up. WCW goes from a 0.93 average in 98 to a 0.55 in 99 to a 0.17 in the year 2000. And that is a 69% drop in the company's main revenue stream over the course of 1 year. And Dave Meltzer says, and this is a direct quote because everything else that I have is just pulled notes and paraphrase. So with the house show revenue cut in half, advertising revenue cut in half or more, and pay-per-view revenue cut less than 1/3, one can see how 15 million in losses can add up to 65 million in losses the next year.
So the writing is on the wall, but there is still the third promotion in town too. So Teddy, give me what you got on ECW, because they're an interesting little nugget in here too. I can't imagine how bad WCW is, and now we're going to go look at ECW.
Yeah, so we call this hashtag things don't get better. Okay, so this is a paraphrase from January Observer. Citing from a number of factors, including the enormous pressure that he's been under over the past year, the large company debt, and what he sees as the future landscape of the business changing, Paul Heyman said that he was in serious negotiations to sell either a majority share or all of Extreme Championship Wrestling. Again, this is January of 2001 is where we're at right now. Paul Heyman, who's 35 at the time, is seeing the changing landscape and believes that the independent operator can no longer compete given its current state. So he talked as recently as a few weeks ago about scaling down the company, scaling back on payroll, and running a regional promotion, but then said the economics of what would amount to running an old school wrestling territory don't work today because of the rising costs of television. So basically what he's saying is that you can't get and maintain television time without lots of money behind a company, and an old school territory can't generate the revenue to support the cost of TV. And that's basically what killed Smoky Mountain 5 years prior to this. So it was that catch-22 of people love the product, but the product couldn't support itself to get the TV, but the TV wasn't there to support the product. So it was, it was doomed. And that's where Paul Heyman sees the ECW at this point in time. Before I move on, I know that you've said before you're not like an ECW guy, but you're watching wrestling at this point in time. So like, can you give me Baby Bake Show ECW thoughts? How did you view ECW here?
At the time, I didn't even know ECW even existed. I was just starting to dip my toes in the water with WWF. So I learned the wrestlers through SmackDown. And that's how I figured out the wrestlers. And then that slowly trickled me into the show. So I remember playing the PS1 game. And then that's kind of like, I remember seeing it. If you want to go back to the pilot episode, you can listen about how I talk about how I got into wrestling. It's definitely vastly different from the show you got right now, but that's where I talk about like my origins of wrestling fandom. I just remember it was a Raw replay that was on like a Saturday morning.
And so what's crazy with me is that I remember seeing and it was an In Your House, and I don't remember which In Your House it was, but there were plants from ECW at an In Your House that were getting involved in an In Your House show. And I did not have the internet yet, and I was 11 or whatever. And I was just like, what is happening? Blah, blah, blah. And you come to find out later that those were ECW guys, because I was fortunate enough to have the ECW broadcast at 11 p.m. or whatever on the local access channel, whatever it might have been. And so, ECW was this almost like forbidden fruit where they would bleep out the F word, and they would play they would play Pantera and stuff were the songs that people came out to, and they would do blood and tables. And so it was this really cool thing. But when ECW started to get mainstream, crazy enough, I cared less about ECW. My ECW wheelhouse was when they were, you saw Beyond the Mat, where Paul Heyman's cutting the promos in his mom's basement or whatever.
Yes.
And those promos, like I can remember hearing his voice screaming, saying, go to the Jaffa Mosque in Altoona or whatever. And me thinking like, oh my God, I gotta be there. Like, and the way that they would sell their merch and everything. And so by this time, I don't know. It's weird because they're almost like the niche band that got too big.
Yes.
Do you know what I'm saying? Whereas their original fans don't like them because they're mainstream, but the mainstream don't like them because they're niche. And I sort of feel like that's where ECW fits in right now.
Yes, that's very true. And that's how I kind of viewed it. It was like, because as I grew up where there wasn't a WCW to rival whenever I was watching. And so they're constantly telling you on television that ECW and WCW sucked. And then whenever they eventually make their comeback, it just makes it feel so much less. But that's why the winners write history.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely it. To go back into the downfall of ECW here, Paul Heyman is saying he would need an offer that guaranteed major cable clearance that would clear up the company's debt, which Dave reports is between $4 and $6.5 million, depending on how you calculate at that time. For a positive, Dave does say that the company has about $2 million in its accounts receivable, which is going to be pay-per-view money that is yet to arrive from shows that were already completed. Dave also does say that Paul is looking for new ownership that could provide an infrastructure such as set up promotions department, a public relations department, etc., as well as take care of current contracts. And I thought that this was really, really interesting nugget, especially because this is in 2001. Paul doesn't want to walk away from ECW, and everybody he's negotiated with wants him to stay, like meaning the talent, and handle the creative of the company, which is where his greatest strengths lie. But Dave says managing money is his own self-professed weakness. And so the crazy thing is that we have seen Paul Heyman thrive in his 9 different iterations with the WWF and WWE, all through creative.
Yes, that's true.
He's never gone back into a true executive role.
No.
And every time there's been great creative, you can almost always find Paul behind it. And these people didn't want him to go. Like, they knew he was helping them get over at that time.
Yeah, that's just crazy to think about how poorly some people talk about him, but they needed him at the end of the day because he was the creative behind them as well.
Loved him. He helped me get here, and also my check bounced.
Yes.
We'll get to that. Dave says that his creative process has been hampered greatly by the past 18 months of spending most of his time in meetings trying to procure various licensing and television deals to keep the company alive. Dave also notes that talent is not an issue right now. So WCW is in a hiring freeze, and the WWF and ECW have a working relationship. So WWF is not rating their roster. And Dave also notes that Jerry Lynn is the only ECW wrestler that is expected to receive an offer from WWF at that time. The last thing that I have is that on the ECW website, there's a claim that something will happen on the 1/7 ECW pay-per-view that will change the face of ECW, although Paul Heyman indicated that it would simply be a surprise newcomer, hinting perhaps at somebody from the WWF and not an announcement on a sale of the company this quickly. There's another business note, though. ECW has scaled back its plans and will be doing only 6 pay-per-view shows in 2001. So ECW has scaled back its plans and will be doing only 6 pay-per-view shows in 2001, as opposed to the 12 that were originally planned.
So that is what is going on in ECW, but there's also trouble in paradise back in WCW as well at this time. What is happening in Atlanta?
A lot is happening in Atlanta. Okay, so we'll get more into Atlanta here shortly, but the really, really quick gist here, for whatever it's worth, the latest timetable that I was given for an announcement, if a sale goes through, so we're talking sale right now in January of 2001, and there are plenty of rumors that it's done, but we've heard so many rumors at this point that I'm not going to believe anything until the announcement is made, is going to be in the January 15th through 29th timeframe. If and when Eric Bischoff gets the company, he'll probably at least give vague blueprints of his battle plan. Also, backstage, there are now issues with Jeff Jarrett being pulled from dates in Puerto Rico, which were with major programs. He was to wrestle Carly Colon, which Carly ends up being old Carlito Cool, and Abdullah the Butcher, with other talent being booked on NWA Wildside. And the issue here is that Double J was supposed to go and make real money in Puerto Rico, and he got pulled, But the Wild Side guys, they let them run it because Wild Side was this like, it's not exactly the same, but it's not far off. It was almost this de facto AEW ROH deal where it was like almost a feeder company.
Okay.
So they had a lot of guys going down there. And so this was causing some strife because you're pulling me from indie dates and you're letting these guys work, but I could be making a lot of money and what's going on.
Gotcha.
Dave also notes, for those keeping track of such things, in the year 2000, the WWF had 5 world title changes, the ECW had 5, and WCW had 26.
26.
This is the same number of world title changes that the NWA had between its inception in 1949 and 1983.
I think 5 is too much.
5 is a lot.
And this is the time where everyone's talking about, well, we had title changes every single week. Yeah, WCW was literally changing titles every single week.
On average, literally, and using literally the correct way, every other week.
Man, it's no wonder they're floundering.
Yeah.
No other champion ever is.
This is correct, man. Hey, when everybody's the champion, nobody cares who the champion is.
That is true. I just can't imagine like watching a show every other week and there's a new champion. It's
correct.
Exhausting.
Well, it lends to one of the problems with AEW now, where every match on their excellent pay-per-view is for a championship. And the problem is that there's 8 matches or 10 matches.
Yeah.
And so every one of those championships matters less. You're focusing less on stories and more on championships to build your stories. Mm-hmm. But then nobody cares about your champions when that's the case. No matter how good the matches are.
That's when they started to lose me, when they added more titles. It's too much for me to think about. And this takes us to our first benchmark show this episode, the last ECW pay-per-view. Mongoose, will you please set us up for the last ever show that we're going to be covering here on the show?
Okay, Dave Meltzer writes, in what may be the swan song of the promotion, ECW promised a holy shit surprise, which prompted debates over methods of promotion today, as well as if there's any future left with the company in the wake of losing its New York television, canceling next month's pay-per-view, and not even producing a new TV show the go-home week before a pay-per-view show. So, my God, man, the writing's on the wall here.
Yes. They don't even have TV for months.
No, there's no go-home show. They canceled. They lost their New York television, which was, obviously their main market. Oof. So, Guilty as Charged on January 7th was held in front of a sellout crowd of 2,500 fans at Hammerstein Ballroom in New York. And Dave says this was the usual ECW show. It came across, with the exception of the return of Rob Van Dam, as more of a regular house show than anything special on pay-per-view. Everyone worked hard. There were some booking holes that were gigantic, but good or bad, and there was more good than bad. That news paled in comparison to the big news. So before I get to the big news, John, what do you think of the show? You watched the show for us.
I did. They did build to what the big surprise was going to be. And spoiler alert, I'm going to get to it. It was Rob Van Dam. But there's some weird things about this show. It opens with 4 minutes of highlight reels for literally no reason. There's no build-in. It's just, it starts and it's a highlight reel. Like I said, I'm not an ECW fan by any means. And I really appreciate what they have accomplished. But we're 13 minutes into the show and then they start rolling the intro. It is just wild. He is so right. There are points in the show where everyone works so well. There is such good things. And then there's just absolute dog shit. This show is an overbooked mess of wonderfulness while being a big steamy pile of shit at the same time. If there's one match you're going to watch out of the show, it's the C.W. Anderson versus Tommy Dreamer I Quit match. That one was awesome. I actually really enjoyed that match. Sandman wins a triple threat match to become your ECW champion, but he's immediately challenged by Rhino. Rhino comes out, spears everybody, and then he wins the title. So that leads to the big reveal at the end by Jerry Lynn, and it is RVD, and RVD wins, and that's how they go off the air. It wasn't a bad show by any means, but it wasn't anything. If you think about One Night Stand in 2005, that show is just so much bigger than this, and it's in the same building, but man, it's not a bad ending for ECW on pay-per-view. It's really not.
Dave says Paul Heyman is still saying that the company wasn't going to shut down. However, there were only 2 shows left on the schedule, sold shows in Poplar Bluff, Missouri, and Pine Bluff, Arkansas, coming this weekend. At press time, nobody had gotten plane tickets for these shows, which is out of the ordinary, but not unheard of. So that's a thing.
That is actually so strange.
There was a 3/11 date for the next pay-per-view announced during the show, although no venue was announced for the event. But ironically, with Rhino versus Van Dam for the title and Doring and Roadkill versus Whipwreck and Tajiri versus Credible and Carino for the tag titles, it appears for the first time in a long time, there is logical show-to-show progression coming out of this one. It's possible to promote pay-per-views every other month without television or running few, if any, house shows. He then goes on, because we're getting to logical booking for pay-per-views, but we're not sending people tickets to shows, so what are we doing? So he says that UFC survived doing this for 7 years. Again, this is 2001. Mm-hmm. But UFC is one of only literally dozens that have tried, so the odds aren't very good to try to run it that way. Unlike ECW, however, UFC doesn't have $100,000 per week payroll to meet, but without a backer, these days of even attempting to meet that kind of payroll are over. Like UFC, ECW does have the brand name and cult following, and more important, has the entire $40 million home pay-per-view universe to draw from, while UFC is limped along with only Dish Networks and Canada, which is probably about 20% of that figure. So check this out, man. This is crazy. Wrestlers received half of their pay at that show, leaving them 7 weeks behind.
Wow.
The morale was said to be very bad.
I can only imagine. I don't even barely have 2 months of pay.
And you're a wrestler, which means that everything's always up front.
Yes.
You're probably fronting your travel. You're probably doing your hotels. You're probably living on a credit card. For the most part, if you're them. Mm-hmm. My God, man. So the news is getting around that despite claims to the contrary, ECW has lost its TV on MSG in New York. They did. Its key market, and didn't even air the night before the pay-per-view in that market, which is true. Van Dam was holding out for the money that he was owed, and Dave notes that he still hasn't been paid that money yet. Dave also says, though, so the reason Van Dam was gone is he was holding out for his money that he was owed. He comes back. Dave then says, if Van Dam had any drawing power, announcing Van Dam versus Lynn as the pay-per-view main event would have meant more than promising the hope of a surprise. So essentially what he's getting at here is that if there was a monetary benefit to have been gained by having RVD at the show, they forfeited that at the expense of having a surprise pop. So everybody exploded when RVD came, but not one person bought the show because of a surprise. And if RVD had actual drawing power, you should have announced him ahead of time.
So at this point in time, the writing's on the wall for ECW. We heard stories for 2 decades that they were having trouble making payroll, and we see that here again in these observers. WCW is way deeper. And because we're sticking to the invasion and not the total collapse of the company, can you give us your Cliff Notes version of the death of WCW?
It is so Cliff Notes, man, because it's deep. It is really deep. Folks, buy The Death of WCW, buy the Nitro book. I haven't even read the Nitro book, but it's worth reading just because I've heard enough credible people say that it's worth reading. And then I'm all for checking out this Death of WCW thing that's about to be coming out here. So we're going to give you, we're going to scratch some surface here, and then maybe we can compare notes later on and see how we did, right?
Yes.
So the general belief is that the announcement of the WCW sale could come before you read this or early next week. And if the papers haven't been signed already, they will be making it official before you read this. And that is a quote from January 15th. Most people close to the situation are under the impression that the deal was finalized over the past few days. The main company backing Bischoff hasn't been speculated on correctly anywhere. Its identity will sale is made public, and it appears to be purchased with the idea of mostly doing an IPO, as it is with a company that specializes in taking its existing media entities and going public with them. So again, this is from January 15th, the speculation as to who's buying WCW. The issue here is the television situation. So TNT is going to switch its focus as a station, and the plan was for Nitro to move to TBS. However, with the company divesting itself of wrestling and wrestling's decline in both ratings and as priority to the market, there is significant talk of when TNT drops wrestling, which may come a lot sooner than later, that TBS won't pick up the new show and Turner Networks will only broadcast one wrestling show per week. At the point, the date becomes important because TBS has a lot of sports commitments, which even though they're lower rated, could take priority over wrestling because they can still sell ads at a better rate and because they're simply seen as more important, ratings be damned, which is evident today with the AEW getting moved off of TNT for the NHL.
Yeah.
They outdraw the NHL every week, and the NHL got paid and put in their time slot.
Yep.
You know, it's so that same thing's happening 25 years later. Because the slot's getting switched around, Wednesday night, and I thought this was super interesting, Wednesday night may be safe because I believe TBS never broadcasts baseball or basketball on Wednesdays.
Huh. Imagine that.
So moving forward to January 22nd, after nearly a full year of various rumors, negotiations, and several near finalized deals, the sale of World Championship Wrestling by Time Warner to Fuscient Media Ventures was officially announced on 1/11. Literally hours before the announcement, the final step of the Time Warner AOL merger had been cleared. Fuscient Media Ventures, a one-year-old company headed by Brian Beadle and Steven Greenberg, who are best known for starting up the Classic Sports Network and then selling it to ESPN, where it became ESPN Classics for $175 million, is the parent company. There will be a greater emphasis placed on the cruiserweight division and on having strong in-ring products with less run-ins, tables, garbage matches, and the elimination of swearing, as wrestlers were told specifically that words like damn, hell, and ass are no longer to be uttered on broadcast. Bischoff described trying to get raunchy to compete with WWF as a failed experiment. And then Dave pontificates, a good wrestling product with a soap opera that makes sense with good matches will, in time, since the company has strong television exposure, make gains in popularity, whether TNA or swearing is a strong foundation of the product or not. A bad product littered with swearing and TNA, which was the Russo product in WCW, was a failure. If the good product had the TNA and the swearing, it would probably work best unless there's an advertiser backlash. Bischoff called Russo's excuses of blaming standards and practices for not allowing him to do certain things a, quote, crock that Russo peddled, end quote, and said Russo's excuses were, quote, a load of crap, end quote. Time Warner, which was wanting to make sure that the new company would be funded well enough to last for at least 1 year, is maintaining a minority interest so that it can retain television rights. Terms of the sale were not revealed publicly, likely because the number was embarrassingly low, as someone close to the situation described the figure as figuratively pennies. John, Bischoff bought WCW.
I thought that was the case.
Yep, that was the Bischoff group. And so him being the spokesman for the company is him legitimately being the head of the company. And so while he was not the funding mechanism behind the purchase, he was to be the head creative guy, et cetera, et cetera. So this, I'll continue on. February 5th, the sale to Fuscient Media has been announced, but hasn't gone through yet. February 12th, the company is planning to do a shutdown on the pay-per-view, which is going to be Slamboree, without a pending relaunch. The idea was for a major angle to end the 218 pay-per-view, which would result in the company ceasing all operations until Nitro on 3/12, where it would resume with new stars and build for a 318 pay-per-view show. So February 12th, we're supposed to shut down and rebrand.
Is this where the idea of the Big Bang is born?
This is not explicitly stated in these issues. However, if you were to read The Death of WCW, or Bischoff talks about this too, this is where this is coming up. Yes.
Okay.
So they are going to shut down, go dark, and then the Big Bang is going to be the rebirth. Okay. February 19th. The shutdown is nixed by Time Warner management because of commitments that have been made to advertisers. So the idea is to possibly do the shutdown angle in late March or early April. And the skinny of this is that they had commitments to advertisers for television, to buildings, etc., and they didn't want to renege on what they had in place already.
Got
So even though there was a vision creatively, the actual company didn't want to do that, and Time Warner is in charge of the TV right now. So they're the ones that are literally calling the shots. So we go to March 5th. The uncertainty of the future of WCW became more apparent this week as all long-term plans changed one more time, stemming from the record low ratings last week, as well as the near collapse of the company's sale. This is where I sidebar, and this is where I empathize with Bischoff, because even though I feel like he lies to me all the time whenever he talks on his podcast, when he says these things about being jerked around, man, he ain't lying. Like he got jerked around up, down, left, and right.
Yeah.
So after both Nitro and Thunder last week drew record low ratings, a 2.05 and a 1.52 respectively, Eric Bischoff made the decision late in the week to significantly rewrite the largely completed Nitro for 226 and bring back Booker T. This completely went against the long-term angle of having the top babyface stars, Hulk Hogan, Bill Goldberg, Booker T, Sting, Kevin Nash, and possibly Diamond Dallas Page at one point, put on the shelf and be brought back en masse for the new beginning. There's your Big Bang. When the storyline aspect of the new owners taking over takes place, and to try to get strong startup momentum and the company turnaround. This all took place with the realistic backdrop of the sale of WCW Diffusion Media Ventures almost falling apart in midweek, when the examination of the latest expenses and loss revealed a more severe downturn in the business than the prospective owners were expecting, as well as problems with new ownership from the TBS side. By press time, it appeared most of the problems had been resolved to a degree, and several close to the situation were expecting the legitimate finalization of the deal to take place within 2 weeks, and perhaps as early as this week. There had been considerable frustration as WCW has been unable to make serious offers for talent until the sale itself is finalized, as TBS will not allow any added talent expenses. However, the long-term plan, as written about last week in The Observer, has been changed once again. The fourth such change in the last 4 weeks. The new plans haven't been finalized, but it appears the idea of everyone being brought back at the 318 pay-per-view has been modified to a degree more than it just pertains to Booker T, although that could change many more times between now and then. At the Nitro production meeting, the latest storyline is the new owner storyline, originally set for the next pay-per-view, would be slowed down.
It's changing weekly. It's insane.
And not only that, man, you have a buyer that is bought, that has been given financials, that is now weary. You have the person that is basically the face of the buyers, that's in charge of creative, now having to redo his creative because the buyers are weary. And this is why this is all a mess.
Yeah. Man, this is crazy.
So we're almost there, man. So we're at March 19th now. So there are many questions and few answers as it regards to the future of World Championship Wrestling. At press time, eerily similar to ECW just 2+ months ago, there are only 3 shows remaining on the books. The Greed pay-per-view show on 3/18 in Jacksonville, Nitro the next night in Gainesville, Florida, and the annual Spring Breakout Nitro on 3/26 in Panama City, Florida. There have been snags in the negotiations in recent weeks. Fusion originally agreed to a purchase price in the neighborhood of $70 million. Oh, brother, this just makes my heart hurt.
I know.
But lowered the offer to $50 million based on the January books, which showed another unforeseen downturn in the company income, even below the devastating final quarter of 2000. So they just got offered $20 million less based on their first quarter.
Oh my word.
We ain't done yet. We're almost there. So there are estimates that the company at this point is losing anywhere between $5 to $7 million each month. Because the company is losing money so rapidly, shutting down running shows and doing television and even pay-per-view, even while continuing to pay the current salaries, at least until they can exercise the 90-day cycles in most of the talent contracts, would cut down on that monthly loss figure temporarily. So them not doing TV and just paying talent is gonna lose them less money than them running shows and paying talent.
That logically doesn't compute, but that's wild to think about.
Right? In addition, with the recognition that the hierarchy at AOL Time Warner with the merger, Steve Heyer, one of the keys in negotiating the deal from the AOL Time Warner side, is no longer with the company. If the deal is to go through, the belief is that Bischoff will do his long planned out angle to shut down the company, perhaps as soon as Sunday's pay-per-view or on 3/26. However, one of those working closest with Bischoff is under the impression that there will be a show on 4/2. No site has been announced, but there is a building on hold, and it's going to be difficult to get it out publicly at this date for a show. But if it isn't done by the weekend, it would be almost impossible, and there's no purpose in making those announcements at this point. This indicates one of two things. The deal being completed, at least at this time, is either not a formality, or Bischoff will be shooting the angle to lead to the shutdown. A 325 house show in Mobile, Alabama has also been canceled. Another indication is that the WWC promotion in Puerto Rico was told virtually all WCW talent would be available to them in April because WCW would be shutting down. So that goes back to what I had said to you about Double J being mad that he couldn't go and work with Carlito and with Abdullah the Butcher. Nuggets, man. We sow seeds on the Podscape. They've also expressed interest in Scott Steiner, Jeff Jarrett, Conan, and Rey Mysterio Jr., among others. There's also the possibility that if the sale doesn't go through, the company would fold after the spring breakout show. There are both upsides and downsides to this, provided Fusion would still want to get into the wrestling business. Upsides include not having to honor the WCW contracts, enabling them to use the wrestlers they want and discards the one that they don't, whether they have contracts with the organization, as well as renegotiate contracts since wrestlers have less leverage in getting huge deals than they did a few years ago when most of those deals were made, nor can the company afford them. So, John, that is where we are in March of 2001.
And the rest is history. Brad Siegel sends a memo to the staff on 3/16/2001, which is March 16th, 2001. That
3/16, isn't that crazy?
It is, especially with Austin. Oh my word, that's crazy. That was actually disingenuous because he told them hiatus at the time, and it was known that WCW would be closing up shop. So, Mongoose, would you like to tee us up for the last official WCW pay-per-view ever?
Okay, so WCW Greed 2001 is the final major show for WCW, at least in this form. And Dave said that this is without even so much of a hint to the public that anything was going amiss other than the lack of mention of a next show. And again, this was the Greed pay-per-view 3/18/2001 from the Jacksonville Coliseum. The show drew 5,030 fans, which is about 3/4 full. That ended up being 3,551 people paying $117,930. So 2/3 of your audience was paid there, John, to go back to what you had asked before.
Gotcha.
So Dave said this show was very sad to watch because not only was it good, which is a crazy thing to say.
I know. It was good.
Not only was it good, but they finally did the things that they've been needing to do for the past 18 months. The booking was good and not overdone. The matches were given time, and many of them were very good as well. And there were attempts through the ring entrances and finishes to elevate younger talent, including Kid Romeo and Alex Skipper as a tag team. Sean O'Hare attempted to be groomed for the superstar level. Sean Stasiak getting a bigger push, as well as Shane Helms as a cruiserweight with star credibility, and Jason Jett as a newcomer getting a huge push in commentary based on him being a good worker. Readers poll. This is sad to read, man.
Yeah.
The readers poll had 64% thumbs up, 22% thumbs down, 14% thumbs in the middle, but 55 people rated this thumbs up, 19 people rated this thumbs down, and 12 rated this thumbs in the middle. Dude, there were less than 100 people that were observer subscribers that watched the show.
I know. It's insane.
The best match was Rey Mysterio and Billy Kidman versus Alex Skipper and Kid Romeo. Dave gave that a 4-star match. Worst match was Sean Stasiak and Bam Bam Bigelow. So, John, you did this for the culture, brother. You did this for the show. You watched this one. What were your thoughts?
The best way to describe this show is how Tony Schiavone opened it with, "If it's professional wrestling, it must be greed." And I exploded when that happened. It's literally as the pyro is going off. There are some weird ways that they shot it. There was like parts of the show where they shot it like a home video style with like the filter on the camera. But Dave, again, is right on the money because it's not like it was bad. And it was actually, they had some good moments. They had the Cruiserweight Tag Team Tournament, where they have to be about the worst looking belts you've ever seen in your life. Those belts looked like dog shit. But they're won by Alex Skipper and Kid Romeo. They defeated Billy Kidman and an unmasked Rey Mysterio, which I probably would have done the reverse there. I felt that it probably would have meant more just knowing what I know now about Kidman and Mysterio. We have a Kiss My Ass tag team match with Dusty and Dustin Rhodes versus Jeff Jarrett and Ric Flair, who is just randomly in street clothes here. Dusty wanted Rick to kiss his ass so badly that he ordered, guess how many burritos he ordered on the show?
It's not fair because I read this, but it's over 200 and I'm dying.
He ordered 270 burritos during the show.
Dave had 7 or 8 lines pertaining to Dusty being able to break wind on demand. And I cut them all out of my notes, but that's hilarious. So the people that knew.
We also see favorite of the show, Hurricane Shane Helms, who is now known as Sugar Shane Helms here on the show. He wins the Cruiserweight title against Chavo Guerrero. The main event is Scott Steiner versus DDP. We love you, Uncle Dally. You got to own your life, baby, and take your deepest breath of the day. You should have hit an extra energy that day because you lost this match to Scott Steiner. Scott Steiner retained as your world heavyweight champion, and I want to save my thoughts on Scott Steiner until the end of the show when we talk about our simulcast, because I do have some thoughts here on Steiner.
Okay, the biggest story backstage from the show involved Lex Luger and Buff Bagwell, who may have greatly hurt the slim chance that Bagwell had and the virtually no chance that Luger had of being picked up by the WWF with their reaction to being asked to put over Chuck Palumbo and Sean O'Hare. Both complained loudly about doing it to the point that most wrestlers thought that they were babies And the way that they stormed out of the building after the meeting to go to the gym made a lot of people think that they weren't going to come back. The match itself was booked for 8 minutes and was supposed to be O'Haire pinning Luger with a Swanton bomb clean. Instead, after doing a lengthy interview, which was on the script, they went into business for themselves and did a spot where they knocked each other out and laid down for O'Haire to do his move on both of them and pin Luger in 54 seconds. Did this catch your radar, dude? Tell me what this was like.
It was bizarre because you just see Luger and Bagwell just lay flat on their back. They just look dead in the water. And then O'Haire hits the Swanton bomb and they're out. And then all of a sudden they just start talking out of nowhere. Like, this is everything that you hear about WCW. Guys going into this for themselves and just pulling the plug and doing whatever the hell they wanted to.
And it's also, I mean, he says point blank that this is the death knell for Buff and Lex. Luger wasn't going to be able to come back anyway.
No.
But you wonder why Buff had such a short leash whenever they did that Buff versus Booker T match or whatever that was, whenever they rebranded the actual WCW show.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's these kind of things, man, where Vince is a million different terrible things, but a legit hammer down boss, he is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he really is. And you don't have people that are habitual line steppers unless you're Shawn Michaels. I guess Shawn Michaels would be the only one ever that was allowed to do that. But you don't have people that step out of line. And I would assume that they were looking for a reason to can Bagwell. And even though that match, which I read a lot of stuff in the lead up to this show that said that match wasn't that bad, but I think that he was looking for a reason to give Bagwell the X-Nay, especially after hearing things like this. The last thing for this is that Dave says that both of them oversold the effects of that move for minutes, including Bagwell trying to spoof his legitimate neck injury by not moving. Dave said that the crowd was all out because it exposed the business. Cameras came back on, Bagwell moved, teasing a recurrence of his old neck injury. And then basically most of the wrestlers and all of the agents were furious about this. The one thing that I do have to put a cherry on this show is that Dave says that it was fitting that the two wrestlers that got the biggest reaction at the last ever WCW pay-per-view were Ric Flair, now 52, and Dusty Rhodes, now 55.
All right, Mongoose, that was our final WCW pay-per-view. And now let's bridge the gap over to the final WCW Nitro.
Hey, Dave Meltzer writes, the purchase of World Championship Wrestling by WWF Entertainment this past week, combined with the ending of all wrestling programming on the Turner Network, changes the entire landscape of pro wrestling industry forever. The final episode of Nitro, at least on TNT, the show which forever changed television wrestling from the squash match / interview format to the idea of weekly blowout, almost pay-per-view like shows, started with the most surreal image of Vince McMahon addressing the audience after purchasing the show. Perhaps even more telling, and the final moment of 29 years of wrestling on Turner Networks was a music video promoting the Steve Austin versus Rock match at WrestleMania. It was an amazing climax to the story, which ended a few days earlier, of wrestling on stations that had been the centerpiece of the opposition to McMahon for the past 16 years. John, you watched the show. What you got?
I did watch the show. I did watch the Raw / Nitro from March 26, 2001. It is Spring Breakout 2001 if you're watching the WCW side. Both of them are obviously on Peacock. But the show opens with Vince McMahon backstage, and this is the visual that every wrestling fan knows. It's Vince standing in front of the chain link fence with the big garbage bins behind him, announcing that he's bought his competition and that the fate of WCW lies within his hands. And then we go to Tony Schiavone. He welcomes you in. There is a ridiculous amount of pyro. It's no wonder they were losing all this money based off this pyro. This is something I would love for AEW and NXT to do, is a spring breakout show like this, an outside venue with a themed show. Bring back outside themed shows. That's all I'm going to say about that. But Tony and Scott Hudson are on the call, and Tony announces that all 5 WCW titles will be defended tonight.
Dave says the last Nitro on 3/26 in Panama City, Florida was apropos on many levels. The crowd was about 1,000 people because of a screw-up. The original plan was to make it a free show, but then about a week before the event, they decided it would be better to sell tickets. Then, when nobody bought tickets, they had a sad crowd. I love they said when nobody bought tickets, they had a sad crowd. They should have sold tickets, though. It makes sense. Last Nitro, you should have sold tickets.
You should have. So Ric Flair's music hits, and he struts that ass down to the ring to address the crowd. Flair has spiky hair, and it's weird. It is weird. I didn't mention that in the Greed show, but it's weird. Rick cuts a promo on Vince saying he'll never hold down the WCW legends. He announces that Sting versus Flair is going to close the show, and the camera pans to the crowd, and there's an incredible sign. It says, Vince, first the XFL, now WCW, you're a dumbass.
I've been waiting the entire show to hear XFL. So just let me interject for just a second here. All right, a little bit of hashtag context. So Dave Meltzer writes, the XFL debuted on February 3rd, 2001 in Las Vegas with the matchup of the New York, New Jersey Hitmen versus the Las Vegas Outlaws. And this is from the February 12th, 2001 Observer newsletter. The show drew a 9.49 rating and a 17 share, leading it to be easily the highest rated show on television for the night. NBC had drawn a 4.7 the previous Saturday night, so they doubled their previous Saturday night rating.
Wow.
Strongest metered markets were Las Vegas at a 17.7, which is where the first game was played, and at Minneapolis at a 14.9, which is the home city of the league's biggest drawing card, announcer Jesse Ventura. The rating was drawn by nothing but hype, and if this league is successful, it will go a long way toward establishing Vince McMahon, for better or worse, mainstream as the greatest sports promoter of our time. Spoiler alert. All 4 live venues drew more than 30,000 fans for the opening weekend, including people legitimately turned away in Orlando, where they didn't open the upper deck, so there were tens of thousands of seats unsold, which led to some bad PR locally for people being turned away, and a lot of negative pub about announcing a sold-out crowd of 36,000. And then I put, they even WWF football. Yeah. Like you could have had 36 legit, but you had to announce 36. You only let 30,000 people in. So the XFL debut proved to be exactly nothing all that extreme. It was neither the extremely bad football that its critics were expecting, nor was it extremely sexual or violent or outrageous, as Vince McMahon had promised. It was an innovative approach to televising football and stretched the boundaries of some things by football standards by implementing wrestling promotional devices. Even with the rule modifications, it simply looked like football with slight modifications such as no coin toss, Dave says didn't miss it, no kicking extra points, Dave says less predictable. He then says sponsors on the fence had to be happy, not just with the rating it delivered and the fan enthusiasm to the product, but that it wasn't as sleazy as feared, and the delay made all the swearing disappear. So they were on a brief delay as part of the contract for the TV negotiations. And so I fast forward 1 week later. The XFL went from television's penthouse to its outhouse in record time as ratings plummeted on NBC to the point that the entire league is already being labeled just 2 weeks in as a major failure in those circles.
What?
It got so bad that on 2/12, John, this is the next week's Observer.
I know,
okay?
it's insane. That's why I laughed so hard.
It got so bad that on 2/12, just 8 days after the initial ratings for opening night came in at well above the levels that even the most optimistic in NBC expected, emergency meetings were held after an embarrassing show with a tremendous finish went 45 minutes long due to an alleged generator problem, an injury, and double overtime. The primetime rating fell from 9.49 to a 4.4 on NBC, And Dave says, I believe with the 45 minutes past prime time that actually did better with the close game in double overtime, the final NBC number was a 4.6. So he's giving them the benefit of the doubt there a little bit. Going from first place to last place in the primetime race over the course of 1 week. So they went below what they were doing the week before whenever they doubled what they did the week before that.
Oh my gosh.
At press time, we don't have the final UPN number, but it appears to be in the 2.0 range as the overnights dropped 33% from 4.2 to 2.8. And last week did a 3.08, again putting it in last place among all network programming, even dueling with head-to-head Sunday Night Heat. The TNN debut, heavily hyped, virtually 24/7 on the network, finished with a 2.4. A scary figure since Roller Jam, with 1/15 the amount of promotion, debuted on the same network at a 1.7. That would combine to give them 8.8 to 9.0 ratings points, already below the 10.0 that the XFL had promised advertisers as the season average. Basically, if they were going to consistently decline, they are at week 6 or 7 levels in week 2. It failed.
And then they tried to do it again later on.
They tried to do it again.
We come back to the simulcast. Our first match is title for title. World Heavyweight Champion Scott Steiner versus U.S. Champion Booker T. I'm going to be honest here. I actually really enjoyed this match. I couldn't help watching here, but I can't think of why didn't we get this Scott Steiner in WWE 2 years later? Booker T is your winner. He becomes your WCW World Heavyweight Champion as he retains his U.S. title as well. I couldn't believe how good Steiner looked here. Like, he actually was working his ass off.
Dave does note that Steiner worked this match with a pinched nerve, and this one was actually, it was billed the week before, but it wasn't a certainty. So not only was he working the way you said he was working hurt.
I mean, hats off to Steiner for that, because he looked really, really good. They come back from commercial with Vince McMahon talking to his attorneys on the phone about how WCW's last show is in some redneck beer joint in Florida. They have a 3-way cruiserweight tag title match to see who will face the cruiserweight tag champs later tonight with the Young Dragons, 3 Count, and the Filthy Animals. This match was awesome. If you love AEW style tag team matches, this has to be the blueprint. Ray and Billy Kidman win, and they will face Kid Romeo and Primetime Elix Skipper for the cruiserweight tag titles.
Dave said that match is the best thing on both shows that night.
So
he loved it too.
It's so good. Back in Vince's office, he is joined by Trish, and we're just going to skip over what happened, given what's happened over the last year with Vince. They do the cruiserweight title match as we get a rematch from Greed, which is Sugar Shane Helms versus Chavo Guerrero Jr., and Shane Helms retains. It's a very quick match. It's not very long. Did the job. They condensed all the matches that they did. They really crammed them in here. Next is Lance Storm versus Mike Awesome as they prepare for their tag team title match. As the Canadian national anthem plays, the camera cuts to Vince as Michael Cole asks Vince for his reaction to the concerns of WCW. He shoos Cole away, and we go back to Tony and Scott questioning what the future holds for WCW. Now Chuck Palumbo and Sean O'Hare come out to defend their titles. Sean O'Hare and Palumbo retain their titles in very quick fashion. These were very quick matches. Next is a tattoo match with Bam Bam Bigelow versus Sean Stasiak with help of Stacy. Stasiak keeps from getting tattooed as he beats Bam Bam in this one is even quicker than the last match.
Dave basically said, thank God it was fast and we didn't have to see Stasiak get tattooed to take up more time.
We go back to Raw with William Regal, who is backstage with Vince, showing off the WrestleMania 17 jersey and asking if Vince really wants to buy that awful WCW. Vince is getting ready for the simulcast as Kid Romeo and Elix Skipper defend their cruiserweight tag titles versus Ray Jr. and Billy Kidman, who were winners of the number 1 contenders match. Billy Kidman and Rey Mysterio win that match. I basically wish that they would have done this on Greed. I don't know why they waited to do it here on the simulcast, but they should have done this at Greed and they should have just retained.
I would assume the idea was that they were hoping that it wasn't dead yet.
I guess. Maybe.
You know what I'm saying? Like it does make sense to have the upstarts win at your pay-per-view and then, like send everybody happy later. But I'm assuming that was it. And that probably feeds more into the idea of they booked that show right. Greed, that is. Like
Cool.
they booked with vision.
Yes.
Even though they're literally going to be folding in 3 weeks.
The camera cuts back to Sting in this awesome promo in the room with the hanging bats. It's such an awesome display of what WWE could have done with the Stinger. Vince is making his walk-in backstage to the ring, and Flair's music hits for the final match in WCW versus Sting. Sting and Rick play all the hits here. It's a glorious end for WCW and Nitro as Sting puts Rick in the sharpshooter and Rick taps. WCW's hero closes this chapter of Nitro.
Dave says that Sting and Flair did their basic match, just an older version of it, for 7 minutes and 17 seconds. It was really cool to see Sting show up for one last show. It really wasn't cool for Nash and Goldberg not to. And then he does note that Hogan wasn't there because he's currently suing the company.
The camera cuts to Vince going back up the ramp on Raw, and I think that this has to be a botch at some point because it looks like he's running up the ramp so that they can hurry up and shoot him coming back down the ramp again. I don't know. Maybe I'm onto something there. Vince states that Time Warner has agreed and signed the deal, but Vince has also verbally agreed, but he has not signed the deal. He will sign live on the air at WrestleMania 17 this Sunday, and he's going to sign it when Ted Turner delivers the contract to him in person. Vince says that he defeated WCW all on his own. It's his effort, his money, and the only way to beat a billionaire is to become one yourself. He keeps teasing that Ted Turner is going to be at WrestleMania, and this is where he mentions Shane for the first time. Shane's music hits, but never comes to the ring. He's actually shown on the Titantron as he is live from Nitro in Panama City Beach, Florida. Shane takes the mic, standing in the WCW ring. He says that Vince's ego got the best of him. He wanted to finalize the deal at WrestleMania. He states that the deal is finalized and the contract does say McMahon. However, the contract reads Shane McMahon. And Shane states that he owns WCW and that Shane in the WCW is going to kick Vince's ass at WrestleMania.
So I need to note that on that next Raw, the show begins with Vince McMahon immediately firing Jeff Jarrett, which, dude, 16-year-old me, my God, I couldn't have been more in love.
I know.
Get him out of my life. So I need to finish this recap, this rundown of January to the end of WCW with this. Vince asks the fans for help if he should hire people. He mentions Hulk Hogan to mostly boos, Luger to mostly boos, Bagwell to a decent amount of cheers, Booker T to a disappointing level of cheers, Steiner to a major pop, and then they chanted Goldberg when Vince asked, and it was a monster pop. Dave says that was so strange because it went against every law of promoting wrestling, and Vince knows those laws better than anyone. You never tease the fans and make them want a match that you can't deliver because it's a waste of their emotions that wrestling attempts to control and manipulate. Just hope they being the WWF, don't fall prey to the cockiness that killed WCW when they thought they were untouchable, because that would be the death of the business for real.
That is part one of the invasion. We're going to leave you here at the very end of the simulcast and Dave's notes. It has been an incredible run to episode 100. We appreciate all of you listening. We can't wait to share more with you next week on part 2. We are going to be taking a look at who got contracts, all of the contract talks, who stayed, who got cut. We take you the whole way up to the Invasion show and the fallout of the full WWF WCW Invasion. We thank all of you for listening. It has been a fun run to 100. We are 100 down, 100 more to go. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Mongoose for Mongoose Reads and all of the research that we've done here. We only have more for you here next week on the Invasion with part 2. Don't forget to subscribe because we have subscriber rewards. That way you get the Rick Rude bonus episode when we hit 400 subscribers. We thank you for listening, and we will see you next time on the Podski.